Okay, so language variation, it's the biggie, it's the big one, it's the cool part, it's the coolest thing. It would be great, ideal, if everyone all over the world spoke the same exact language in the same exact way. We could almost all communicate seamlessly, have one big homogeneous language community. But in the real world, not so much, right? We see clearly that we have a heterogeneous language, a human family. We see clearly that there's a difference between English and Spanish, right? But that's okay. They're not wrong. They're just different. They each have their own patterns. They each have their own rules, right? We see that they're different from Chinese, which has its rules and patterns, which is different from, on and on. You get the idea. And we also probably understand that within the English language group, not the human language group, but the English language group, that we have Standard American English, which is called SAE, by the way. You have British English. It has its own rules and patterns, right? But its phonology is different. They use different morphology sometimes. They have different lexical items. Or we have the different ones. I don't know. Which is it? See? Syntactic structures can be varied from Standard American. We see that they're different, right? That they're varieties of the same mother language known as English. But they have their own patterns and rules, right? Okay. But we also see that within Standard American English, there's variation from that. We have Southern American English. We have Black Vernacular English. We have New York English. And each of those has its own patterns, don't they, and rules, and are completely structured. So when we have these differences between what we call the standard and these dialects, we call them variations. And if there's a lot of variations between them on all of these levels, phonological, morphological, and we almost can't even understand each other when we speak, we would call that a dialect. That's a simplification of what a dialect means, but there's really no true black and white line between what a language is and what a dialect is. I'm just telling you. But if there's only very few variations, like maybe the phonology you notice is very different, like you have that southern accent, I can't do it, I'm not from the South, we would call that an accent. Because all we notice is just the phonology. We can speak to each other. We are mutually intelligible. We don't have too many problems. But really what's happening is there are also these other differences going on. We just don't really notice them as much. So my favorite example of that was when I lived in the South, and my roommate says, she's looking at her food, she goes, "I'm trying to get sick." And I was like, why would anyone try to get sick? And she looks up and she goes, "Oh, honey, no, that means I'm coming down with something." I'm like, ow! So clearly, it's more than just phonology that differs, isn't it? Soda, pop, Coke, the whole thing. And what's really interesting is each individual person has their own individual way of using their own language, and that's called an idiolect, individual language. No two people speak exactly the same way. Some people have certain pet phrases. Some people pronounce certain things in a weird way, and all that kind of stuff, in a highly varied way, I should say. So the bottom line is you have all human languages, which clearly are not mutually intelligible, so they vary from one another, right? And then within that you have any given language, which has its own dialectical variations, which has its own individual variation, which is an idiolect, right? So when it comes down to it, the use of language is wildly variable. And again, this is another area where we don't have any black and white. Where one language ends and the next begins is a very difficult call when you talk about language variation. When I'm in the South, when I lived there, I was young, woman, European American, from the north. I would meet someone who was from there, the south, who may have been male, who was African American, who was older, and we wouldn't be mutually intelligible. We wouldn't even be able to carry on a conversation. Yet no one would argue that either of us is not speaking English. We're both speaking English, right? We're both born in this country. But sometimes for political reasons, socioeconomic reasons, governments say that this group of speakers doesn't, that's really the same language, because we don't want to recognize those people as having any socioeconomic or cultural power. So we're going to call your language the same as ours, especially in a place like China, where the government says it's all Cantonese, even though they're not mutually intelligible. They can't speak to each other. But one of their problems is they have the same written system, because their written system is based on is conceptual rather than linear or phonological like ours is. So that's a problem. And then there are other places where they say they speak separate languages, yet they meet and they are completely mutually intelligible. They can speak to each other, but oh no, it's my country speaks this language, and oh no, my country speaks this other language. It's a completely different language. Well, then how are we talking to each other? Like in Bosnia, Croatia, that kind of area. So what does that have to say about when we're learning American Sign Language, or when people use American Sign Language, or when we become interpreters and we ask about the language preference of the deaf person? And they always say it's American Sign Language. They never say, oh, I sign English. They always say, I'm an ASL user, right? And then you meet them, and they're using English idioms, they're using initialized words, they're using complete English syntax, and you're like, okay, where's the ASL? So it's kind of an issue when we're learning language. We don't really know where does ASL end and English signing or English-like signing begin. We can tell you what English-like behaviors look like, but we can't really say, black and white, this is where you draw the line, right? And where you have policy and planning coming in for American Sign Language, you see a lot with education. We will have an ASL-only education system. The choice that I've made to speak through this entire class has shown a policy of inclusion for second language learners who may not be proficient yet in ASL. Whereas if you go to a conference of interpreters, you're going to see the policy of American Sign Language to make sure that there is inclusion for people who don't have access to spoken language because they are deaf. So there are reasons behind language policies, and but sometimes the differences between the languages are not that clear, are not that black and white.